Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Hi, everybody. It has been a hot minute since I did a podcast. And most of the podcast content has had some level of existential inquiry, but a lot of psychology and straight out therapy. And I'm going to expand a little bit more into the broader sense of JS Wonders. I had a cancellation, and as you can see, I'm sort of dressed in my bike gear because I bike commute to and from the office. I thought I'd fit one in that probably won't take quite as long as usual. A topic of extreme interest to me since I was a little kid is the nature of consciousness and the nature of meaning and what makes something have meaning and what's meaningful. And obviously, I was an English major undergrad, so I read lots and lots of literature, and you take classes in semiotics and rhetoric that's all about language. Obviously is about meaning and what makes something mean something. Is it the fact that the person intended it to mean that? Is it fact that the person who heard it or received the message made a certain sense of it? Is it shared? At the time, I was firmly in, well, if you intend the meaning, if someone receives it wrong, that's their problem. That doesn't make it mean something else. And I was really in that camp because there were lots of intense debates and serious disagreements and conflicts over identity. And both of my parents liked to impose their own, what they believed objective meanings were on everything. And so I had grown up very, very defensive around the meaning that I intend. What I intend to say is what I mean. And since then I've softened, and it's like, well, maybe it's some version of meaning is created between the communicator and the person who receives the message. The fact is the person receiving the message does as much work to create meaning of it as the person intending it. That's just a psychological fact, right? In teaching, you learn that. It's like people don't come in as blank slates. They come in with their brains programmed with culture, their own personality, their own experiences. And even when you're intending to teach hard facts, people receive it and make sense of it in the context of their own minds. And so people make sense of. I experienced a lot of that as a kid when I read a lot, and I read many books that were way past my level, and there were words or things that I didn't really understand. I just made up the meaning. I would just keep reading and playing whatever movie my head was constructing of what I thought that book was. And sometimes I would go back and read it later, like I would read it when I was 7 or 8 and then read it again when I was 15, and realize that there were significant ways in which the story had not been intended the way I had made sense of it. Like literally factually, I had not really understood. And there were a significant number of times that I liked better what I had made up than what they had intended. So anyway, to bring it to the point, when you get into spirituality, metaphysics, and consciousness becomes important for me because it's directly related to suffering. And from my maybe limited or simplistic view, if something is mechanistic, just cause and effect, like one rock rolls and clinks into the next rock and that rock falls into the volcano and gets melted, there's no suffering involved because those rocks are not conscious and there's no intention. There's nothing going on other than the laws of physics, just sort of one thing affecting the next thing. But it requires conscious awareness and conscious awareness of your experiences to suffer or to experience pain. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But I did spend a lot of time in philosophy classes really focused on, the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? But consciousness was really the focus for me. It was really what I was interested in, the nature of consciousness and whether you can experience it, whether it's real or not, whether we're mechanistic or not. And I do believe that language, pardon me, I continue itching my eye, I got an itch. Language is a logical proof that consciousness exists. I might be wrong, but this is my argument. And this is why I believe that consciousness, or that meaning cannot exist without conscious awareness, without consciousness, right? Is my argument. Thus, meaning is created by conscious beings. Meaning does not inhere in the thing. Like I said, if a rock accidentally gets knocked by gravity into a volcano, there was no horrible holocaust of rocks and no evil intent to inflict suffering. It's just physics, right? So an event having meaning requires a conscious being experiencing it and imbuing the event with meaning. And so the test, or what to me is the proof of this, is I used to think through these thought experiments. If there's a mountain and there's a bunch of rocks that through rain and degradation of the soil and the structure of the mountain have become loose, and then at some point there's enough gravity and the ice melts and a cascade of rocks comes raining down, falls off of a cliff, and lands in the earth below. And just by random chance, just happens to be configured to look as if they are letters. And those letters just happen by chance to be organized into a Shakespearean sonnet or a play. Maybe it's to be or not to be. That is the question, right? Does that mean something? Does that mean the mountain is speaking Shakespearean prose? My argument is no. Now, let's not get into the weeds of people would say, well, the chances of that would never happen. That's why that if it's configured into words, it must mean something, blah, blah, blah. No. Forget about it. Let's say infinity exists. If you have infinity amount of time, in infinity, there is going to be an occurrence where there happen to be mountains and there happens to be ice and there happens to be gravity and rocks happen to fall, and they're going to happen to fall exactly into the configuration that looks like the letters that spell a Shakespearean sonnet. If you have infinity, that's going to happen. Though absurdly unlikely things happen within infinity, right? You get that. So this happens, right? Just the laws of physics. And my argument is no, that's not a Shakespearean sonnet. It doesn't mean anything. If a conscious being comes by who happens to have been exposed to Shakespeare, well, Shakespeare is a conscious being who did intend something and used language as a medium to express meaning. And then the readers can receive and debate the meaning and assess that, yes, Shakespeare did mean that, or maybe we don't know what he meant, or maybe I made a meaning of it that fits more into a modern context because I'm a conscious being and I did that. But that conscious being walking by that configuration of stones, there's no meaning in it, right? If there's no conscious being, there's no meaning. So my argument is that meaning inheres in consciousness. Conscious awareness brings meaning, imbues meaning. Now, here's a second test of this. The fact that language is arbitrary indicates that it is conscious awareness that creates meaning. What do I mean when I'm saying this? Well, I could not, like if I didn't know Spanish, had never heard of Spanish. In fact, I'm an alien who communicates through some medium that is not vibrating vocal cords and creating, waves through the air, sound waves through the air that land on someone's eardrum and tickle the inner cochlea, and that gets translated, all of those things, that's just physics. It's not inherently meaning, right? But mi amor, which means my love, only means my love because Spanish speakers decide arbitrarily that that's what it means. If you and I were to get together and decide we're going to make our own language, and I decided that flog or flip or dupe or zip or whatever, right? All of these things are probably some word in some language. Let's say I decided this object, which is intended to contain a liquid that people tend to drink, is called flob. Flob. And if you, as a conscious, aware being, go, okay, John, I'll agree to this. It's arbitrary, but I don't care. Flob. Got it. And then I could go flob, and that person would be aware that I'm offering them this container. And they could go flob. I'd go, oh, and I, as a conscious being, would understand that. Nobody but us two would understand that. The reason for that is because the meaning of language is arbitrary. You can just assign it. Now, maybe we evolved to create meaning in other ways, and maybe initially meaning was a more physical, biological thing. Onomatopoeia sort of, if you get hit in the stomach and you're like, oh, right? That's sort of a physiological, almost like there's a physics to it, but because there's a vocalization and vocalizations evolved into language, ooh or oof has evolved in the English language to mean sort of like, oh, I got impacted by something. It might be a work situation, or I might literally have gotten punched in the stomach, but either way, everyone knows. So it sort of evolved out of physics and biology, but it becomes arbitrary because someone in another language could say, oh, we make that sound this way, right? So in Amharic, the word for thank you is amasiganalo. I'm not saying it with a very good accent. Don't worry about it. It's just, the point is, it's arbitrary. Gracias in Spanish. Shokran in Arabic. Amasiganalo in Amharic. Merci in French. I don't have a good accent. Don't worry about it, right? It's not the point. The point is, all of those things have the same meaning, but different cultures have assigned their own sound, right? So they've taken some act of physics that has a certain frequency and a certain sound in a certain way, and they've isolated that and gone, well, when we do this particular frequency, this particular way, arbitrarily it's assigned this meaning. But the meaning, the only reason you can do that is because you have two conscious beings who are consciously aware who can arbitrarily choose, right? So you start seeing that this pulls in these things that we find inextricable from consciousness. Consciousness seems to imply a priori choice. You can't talk about consciousness without saying choice, right? Physically, you might be totally limited. You could come along and you could paralyze somebody and you could close their eyes and plug their ears and, right? But they can choose to experience it, or they can choose to relate to the experience in the way that they choose. That might be really hard, but they could choose to go, oh, I'm just going to take this as a blessing, and I'm just going to meditate for the rest of my life and achieve these amazing deep states. Or they could be like, I'm going to be terrified and live a life of intense suffering and misery, whatever, right? So to assign meaning requires consciousness. To assign implies choice. So you start building in that consciousness is inextricable from choice and meaning. For something to be meaningful, consciousness has to be present. And it's interesting that in quantum physics, this is now beginning to show up mathematically, in that, Schrodinger's cat and experiments like that, thought experiments like that, state or attempt to prove that things don't assume an actual concrete position until they're observed. There's an observer, consciousness. So it is in the presence of consciousness that a thing is rendered into a concrete, specific state. Right? That's true in quantum physics. But logic is presupposing this before you get to quantum physics, right? Because you can't talk about something meaning something without consciousness, and you can't talk about consciousness or meaning without the ability to choose. Now remember, I'm saying this, I don't mean this that you can't enslave someone and take away their ability to choose, or you can kill someone, like, right? But what I mean is, if meaning inheres in consciousness, it also implies choice, because to imbue something that has no meaning with meaning, you must arbitrarily choose. You must arbitrarily choose it. Just the way shukran, thank you in Arabic, shukran doesn't mean thank you in English. It doesn't mean anything in English. Right? Until a conscious being goes, oh, that's that language, and that's what it means in that language, and now I know that. I have brought consciousness to it, and I have gone, well, I'm also going to assign this meaning to it. I'm going to honor the meaning that all of these other people assign to this frequency and this vibration from my vocal cords that propagate through the air. And I'm going to arbitrarily agree with you. Yes, it doesn't have to. There could be another language. There are languages where a word that means something in one language has a completely different meaning in another language. I think my brother was telling me about one of these words. I don't know, was it in Polish or Hungarian or something? I don't know. It was a word that meant thank you or something, but basically it sounded roughly like pussy. So from his perspective, people were saying pussy, pussy. And of course, that arbitrarily means something in English that might be funny or risque or whatever, that it didn't mean in that language. And so they were using the same frequencies, the same lip configuration, a very similar sound, but because the meaning is arbitrary, we assign the meaning, consciousness assigns the meaning. That's why you can have these mix-ups. So I wanted to posit that. Now that gets, why is that even important to me? There are a lot of reasons. One, I'm really, really interested in consciousness and how consciousness interacts with life, suffering, and a lot of it is really suffering and the psychological and emotional imprisonment people feel from suffering. And a lot of it was my attempt to work out, what are our possibilities here? What are our possibilities for freedom? What does it mean to be conscious? Is it possible that we're just mechanistic? Is it possible to suffer as a mere mechanism? Logic has led me to say no. We are conscious and we bring meaning. It's also interesting that Buddhist and Hindu belief track or map onto what I'm saying, which is whatever this reality isn't, the realness isn't in the reality in these situations and circumstances. Those actually have no meaning inherently. It is us conscious beings that bring the meaning. And if we have learned to create heavy or difficult or painful meanings, then we suffer. If we've learned to create loving, joyful, free meanings, then we don't. But underneath all of it, right, people who are quote unquote enlightened would then be people who have merely realized it doesn't matter whether I feel free or not, or suffer or not, or I'm joyful. Like the truth is I'm just consciousness, and consciousness is free of all of it. Consciousness is merely the observer. So that sort of tracks onto Buddhism. So it gets interesting, right? This examination of consciousness. And of course, this has tendrils into psychology and how much I see when you're working with someone, often because of childhood trauma, they're making meaning of experiences they have with their spouse or with coworkers or whatever, and they're just feeling tortured. They're suffering terribly. And from outside you, like the therapist or someone else might be looking at that and be like, I wouldn't even care. I don't even care. Like those people could do or say those things. I don't give a crap. I'm happy. I don't care what they say. They're idiots. And yet at the same time, the things where I make heavy, dense, painful meanings, I'm suffering terribly and talking to people, the situation is like this, and what do I do about it? And why do these people act this way? I just don't get it. Why do we have to be so mean to each other? And someone else might be like, why do you even care? That wouldn't even bother me. Because the scary thing is, in the end, is we're probably creating all the meaning. We're probably creating all the meanings. And that tracks onto Hinduism, Buddhism, and also is now starting to map onto quantum physics. That these experiences, these things here, settle into a measurable state only once I observe it. And it's possible that I may be eliciting the kind of state that it settles into, but that I'm not conscious enough of my conscious choices. I'm making choices that have results, but I'm not conscious enough to see that I'm making choices. So I can't avoid that I make choices, and those choices sometimes result in my suffering, but I have not raised my awareness enough to go, oh, I'm doing that, so I can just stop doing that. So it gets more complex, but I wanted to lay the groundwork for essentially saying consciousness is inextricable from meaning and choice. Meaning, for language to have meaning, indicates that you have the choice to arbitrarily assign meaning to these vibrations created by vocal cords. It could be by hand movements, right? Sign language, like anything. If you intend the meaning, you can create the meaning. If you have another conscious observer to interact with and they agree with the meaning, you can have a conversation and you can connect to someone in that way. And I used the thought experiment of stones randomly rolling down the side of a cliff and landing in the grass and appearing to be configured into letters that spell out a Shakespearean sonnet. Is that really a Shakespearean sonnet? My argument is no. Without a conscious observer, no. Without someone imbuing meaning into it, no. So I just wanted to lay the groundwork because there's more, a lot of that thinking has gone into me as a therapist, but also my own personal work. And instead of always seeking to reduce suffering, which certainly I hope to reduce my own and others, but it's more important to be free. And sometimes we suffer in service of learning freedom. And freedom is more important than suffering. And so that tracks for me because freedom maps onto the ability to choose. That meaning relies on consciousness and the ability to choose. Things cannot be meaningful if you are not consciously aware and able to choose. And if that's true, then all meaning is theoretically within our control. And certainly psychologically, when you look around at the world, the people who suffer the most are the people who go around letting everyone else create meaning. Right? They're getting butthurt and feeling tormented if someone's mean to them at the grocery store, rather than just according that person like, oh, maybe they had a bad day. It wasn't about me. They will create meaning about me. Like everyone treats me this way and the person was such a jerk and why is the world like this? And pretty soon they're depressed and suicidal. And well, that person is literally creating that meaning. But the suggestion at some level, and this is where it gets uncomfortable because people get abused and are being abused as adults, but they get abused as children, which they don't choose. The difficulty is that there's a suggestion, logic suggests that maybe we all create our suffering, not pain, but our suffering, in our refusal to be consciously aware of the ways in which we imbue things with meaning. And we choose for them to mean that because we are the conscious being with the power to freely choose, and that free choice can arbitrarily assign meaning to things. That tracks onto Buddhism. But I'm not a spiritual leader. I don't know what's true. I just think it's very interesting to think through, and I wanted to lay that groundwork. All right, guys, I am off from my bike commute. I love you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And I'll talk to you next time. Take care.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.